In the small, sun-baked town of Rio Verde, Texas, Sheriff Marcus Big Mike Thompson was a legend, a towering figure with a badge that gleamed like a promise. He was the man who stood between order and chaos. But in the summer of 2019, that promise shattered, not by a criminal, not by an outsider, but by the man who had sworn to protect them. This is the story of how one sheriff's deal with the devil turned a quiet border town into a blood-soaked battleground, and how the cartel's retribution left a community in ruins. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a sheriff, he was a symbol. A former high school football star turned lawman, he was the pride of Rio Verde. With his wife Keisha and their 2 kids, Malik and Tiana, he seemed to have it all. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The border town was a pressure cooker of drugs, violence, and desperation. For years, Marcus had fought to keep the cartel's poison out of his streets. But when the bills piled up and the pressure mounted, he made a choice. One that would change everything. It started with a favor, a shipment allowed to pass, a name erased from a report. But in the world of the cartel, favors are never free. And Marcus was about to learn that the hard way. The cartel didn't just want a sheriff, they wanted a puppet. And Marcus, desperate to keep his family afloat, played the part. For years, he balanced on a razor's edge, keeping the town safe while ensuring the cartel's shipments moved smoothly. But power is a dangerous illusion, and Marcus was about to lose control. The cartel's demands grew. More shipments, more protection, more silence. Marcus's double life became a tightrope walk. By day, he was the public hero, the man who stood tall against the tide of crime. By night, he was the cartel's inside man, ensuring their operations ran without a hitch. But the cracks were starting to show. Whispers began to circulate among his deputies. Strange discrepancies in reports. Shipments seized, yet the same drugs reappeared on the streets weeks later. Marcus tried to keep it all under control, but the pressure was mounting. Then came the first warning. A dead dog left on his porch. A black Labrador, lifeless, its body cold and stiff. No blood, no wounds, just poison. The message was clear. The cartel doesn't send flowers. They send messages. And when Marcus found his dog lying lifeless on his front steps, he knew the game had changed. He tried to convince himself it was a scare tactic, a warning to keep him in line. But deep down, he knew the truth. The cartel's patience was running thin. The threats escalated. A slashed tire, a single bullet left standing upright on his front porch. Each one was a reminder that he was no longer in control. The cartel had noticed his hesitation, his attempts to push back, and they weren't going to let it slide. Marcus tried to stay ahead, to fix the damage, but the cracks were spreading. His wife, Keisha, had started to notice. The late nights, the unexplained cash, the way he jumped at shadows. She confronted him one night, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "Tell me the truth, Marcus," she said, her eyes locked on his. "What's going on?" He tried to explain, to downplay it, but she knew better. The money, the secrets, the lies. It was all too much. And then there was their daughter, Tiana, a teenager with a restless spirit and a love for social media. One night, she posted a picture of the family truck parked outside an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place Marcus had told her to stay away from. She didn't know what was inside. She didn't know it was where her father had arranged for a cartel shipment to move through unnoticed. But someone else knew. The picture spread like wildfire. A cartel scout saw it, and just like that, a routine operation became a disaster. Marcus spent the next day trying to fix it, calling in favors, reassuring the cartel that it was just a mistake. But the damage was done. That night, he kissed Keisha on the forehead, told Malik and Tiana goodnight, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a lead blanket. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know when. The morning of the tragedy began like any other. The Texas sun stretched over Rio Verde, casting long golden rays over quiet streets. Marcus woke before dawn, the weight in his chest heavier than usual. He knew today wasn't normal. He knew something was coming, but he didn't know when or how. Keisha barely looked at him as she moved around the kitchen, pouring coffee, buttering toast. Tiana sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the danger her last post had invited. Malik sat across from her, complaining about an upcoming math test. For a moment, Marcus thought about telling them, about warning them, packing them up, sending them away. But where would they go? The The cartel's reach stretched far beyond Rio Verde. Running wouldn't save them. He stood, kissed Keisha on the forehead, and grabbed his keys. "Be safe today," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gave a small nod and stepped outside. The morning air felt different, too still. Down the street, a black SUV sat idling. He noticed the tinted windows, the engine running despite no one seeming to be inside. His pulse quickened. Was this it? Was it starting already? He climbed into his patrol truck and drove toward the sheriff's office. What he didn't know was that the cartel had been planning this for weeks. They weren't going to send a single assassin. That would be too clean, too quick. No, they wanted to make an example out of him. They wanted him to suffer. The operation had been put together by El Zorro himself, a high-ranking enforcer for the cartel. 6 men, 4 vehicles, 3 attack locations. The first team was already moving into place. Marcus pulled into the station just as the first call came through. Shots fired, residential neighborhood, unknown number of assailants. His gut twisted. Then the second call came. "We have reports of a break-in, same area, multiple armed suspects." Marcus's blood ran cold. His radio crackled again. "Sheriff," the dispatcher's voice was tense. "It's your house." His hands went numb. His mind emptied. The only thing left was the instinct to move. He slammed the truck into gear, tires screeching against asphalt as he sped through town, sirens wailing. But deep down, he already knew. He was too late. It had started just minutes after he left. 2 men dressed as repair workers had knocked on the Thompson family's door. Keisha, already suspicious of everything lately, hesitated before opening it. "We got a work order for the gas line," one of them said, holding up a clipboard. "Wrong house," she said, starting to close the door. That was when the first gunshot rang out. Keisha fell backward, hitting the floor, clutching her bleeding shoulder. The 2 men forced their way inside. Tiana screamed. Malik ran for the back door. One of the men grabbed Keisha by the hair, dragging her across the floor. "Where is your husband?" he demanded. But Keisha didn't answer. She spat blood at his feet. The second man was already moving toward Tiana. Then another shot. This one from the hallway. Malik. The boy had grabbed his father's spare pistol from the bedroom drawer. He was shaking. His hands unsteady, but he fired again. The gun clicked empty. The second man turned, aimed, and fired. Malik crumpled against the wall. Tiana sobbed. Keisha tried to crawl toward her son. The first man knelt beside her, pressing the barrel of his pistol against her temple. "This is what happens," he murmured, "when your husband makes bad choices." A final shot echoed through the house. Outside, the black SUV peeled away just as the first neighbors ran toward the sound of gunfire. Marcus was still 3 minutes away when the second attack began. 2 more gunmen entered the sheriff's office, guns hidden beneath loose jackets. They walked past the front desk, nodding at the deputy on duty. Then, in one motion, they pulled their weapons and opened fire. Bullets tore through the station. Officers scrambled for cover. Papers shattered glass and blood covered the floor. One of Marcus's closest deputies, Officer Jimenez, was hit in the first few seconds. He fell forward, clutching his side, gasping for air. The gunmen didn't stop. They moved room by room, searching for one person, the sheriff. But Marcus wasn't there. One of the gunmen radioed in. "He's not here." A voice responded, calm and unbothered. "Doesn't matter. Finish it." More gunfire. More bodies fell. Then the 2 men calmly walked back outside, climbed into a waiting vehicle, and disappeared into the morning traffic. Marcus's truck skidded to a stop in front of his house. The front door was wide open. He ran inside, heart pounding, already knowing what he would find. Keisha, Malik, Tiana. The silence was unbearable. His world had ended in minutes. A scream built in his throat, but nothing came out. His hands trembled as he reached for Keisha, cradling her lifeless body, whispering her name over and over as if it might bring her back. The sirens were distant now. The radios crackled with voices he couldn't hear. The world blurred, then movement. Tiana. She was barely breathing, her eyes fluttering open. Marcus's fingers pressed against her pulse. Faint, weak. "Hold on, baby. Hold on," he whispered, scooping her up and stumbling outside just as the first police cars arrived. The medics rushed toward him, taking Tiana from his arms. Someone was yelling orders. Deputies were securing the scene. Marcus barely noticed. His mind was stuck on one thing. This wasn't just a hit, it was a message. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted him to live in pain. As the news spread, the town of Rio Verde was plunged into chaos. Neighbors stood in their yards, their faces pale with shock. Reporters swarmed the streets, their cameras capturing the devastation. The sheriff's house, once a symbol of safety, was now a crime scene. Blood stained the floors, bullet holes riddled the walls. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Thompson sat on the curb, his head in his hands, his world in ruins. The medics worked frantically to stabilize Tiana. She was rushed to the hospital, her condition critical. Marcus wanted to go with her, to be by her side, but the FBI had other plans. Agents descended on the scene, their faces grim. They had questions, a lot of questions. And Marcus knew he didn't have the answers they wanted. "Sheriff Thompson," one of the agents said, his voice cold and detached, "we need to talk." Marcus nodded, his mind numb. He followed the agent to a black SUV, where they sat in silence for a moment. Then the questions began. "When did the threat start?" the agent asked. "Who do you think is behind this?" Marcus hesitated. How much could he say? How much did they already know? The truth was, he didn't know who had ordered the hit. The cartel was a hydra, cut off one head, and two more grew in its place. But he had his suspicions. El Zorro. The name sent a chill down his spine. He had met the man only once, in a dimly lit cantina on the outskirts of Laredo. The meeting had been brief, but the message was clear. "You're already dead, Sheriff," El Zorro had said, his voice dripping with menace. "You just don't know it yet." Marcus had tried to play it cool, to negotiate, but El Zorro wasn't interested in deals. He was interested in sending a message. And now, that message had been delivered in blood. As the FBI pressed him for answers, Marcus felt the walls closing in. He had spent years building a life, a reputation, a legacy, and in one morning, it had all been torn apart. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Tiana fought for her life. The doctors worked tirelessly, their hands moving with precision as they tried to stop the bleeding. She had been shot twice, once in the shoulder, once in the abdomen. The wounds were severe, but she was a fighter, just like her father. As the hours passed, her condition stabilized. She was out of immediate danger, but the road to recovery would be long. Back at the sheriff's office, the FBI was piecing together the puzzle. The attack had been meticulously planned. The gunman had known exactly where to go, who to target, and how to escape. This wasn't the work of amateurs. This was a professional hit, carried out with military precision. And the more they dug, the more they realized how deep the corruption went. Marcus's financial records were a mess. Offshore accounts, unexplained cash deposits, wire transfers to shell companies. It was a web of deceit, and Marcus was at the center of it. The FBI's forensic accountants worked around the clock, tracing the money, following the trail. And what they found was damning. Marcus hadn't just been taking bribes, he had been an active participant in the cartel's operations. He had helped them move drugs, launder money, and eliminate rivals. He had betrayed his badge, his town, and his family. As the evidence piled up, Marcus's world continued to crumble. His deputies, once loyal, began to turn on him. They had trusted him, followed him, and now they felt betrayed. One by one, they came forward, sharing stories of Marcus's double life, the late-night meetings, the unexplained absences, the sudden influx of cash. It was all coming to light, and there was no way to stop it. The media had a field day. Headlines screamed across the front pages. Sheriff betrays town. Cartel massacre in Rio Verde. A family destroyed by greed. The story was everywhere, and Marcus was the face of it. His once sterling reputation was now synonymous with corruption and betrayal. And as the days turned into weeks, the pressure became unbearable. Then came the final blow. Tiana woke up. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she was disoriented. The beeping of the machines, the sterile smell of the hospital, the pain. It all came rushing back. And then she remembered her mother, her brother, the gunshots, the blood. She began to cry, her body shaking with sobs. A nurse rushed to her side, trying to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be found. Her family was gone. Her life was shattered. And her father, the man she had once idolized, was at the center of it all. When Marcus heard the news, he broke down. He had lost everything: his wife, his son, his reputation. And now his daughter was awake, and he couldn't face her. How could he explain? How could he make her understand? He had made a deal with the devil, and the devil had collected. But the cost was more than he could bear. The FBI continued their investigation, and the more they dug, the more they uncovered. Marcus wasn't the only one involved. The corruption ran deep, touching every level of law enforcement in Rio Verde. Deputies, judges, even the mayor. It was a systemic failure, and the FBI was determined to root it out. Arrests were made, indictments were handed down, and one by one the guilty were brought to justice. But for Marcus, there was no justice. Only guilt, only regret. He sat in his cell, staring at the walls, replaying every decision, every mistake. He had thought he was in control. He had thought he could outsmart the cartel, but he was wrong. Dead wrong. And now, he was paying the price. The trial was a media circus. Reporters from across the country descended on Rio Verde, eager to cover the downfall of a once respected sheriff. The prosecution painted Marcus as a man who had betrayed his oath, his colleagues, and his family. They presented text messages, bank records, and cartel informant testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's defense team tried to argue coercion, claiming that he had been forced into working with the cartel, that threats had been made against his family. But the jury wasn't buying it. After weeks of testimony, the verdict was delivered: guilty. Marcus Thompson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Marcus sat in silence, his head bowed. There were no tears, no outbursts, just a quiet acceptance of his fate. He had made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from Marcus's betrayal sent shockwaves through Rio Verde and beyond. State lawmakers pushed for sweeping reforms in small-town law enforcement agencies, increased oversight, stricter accountability. The goal was to prevent another Marcus Thompson, to ensure that no sheriff, no lawman could ever betray their oath so completely. For Tiana, life would never be the same. She survived her injuries, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would last a lifetime. She moved away from Rio Verde, trying to start over, but the memories followed her. The sound of gunshots, the sight of blood, the loss of her mother and brother. It was a burden she would carry forever. And for Marcus, life in prison was a daily reminder of his failures. He spent his days in a cell, staring at the walls, replaying the choices that had led him there. He had once been a hero, a man who stood for justice. But in the end, he had become the very thing he had sworn to fight against. A criminal, a traitor, a man who had lost everything. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a man who made a deal with the devil, a man who paid the ultimate price, and a town that will never forget the betrayal that tore it apart. If this story shocked you, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The massacre in Rio Verde didn't just shock the town, it sent tremors across the entire state of Texas. Within hours, the small, dusty streets of Rio Verde were swarmed with federal agents. Black SUVs lined the roads, their windows tinted, their occupants armed and ready. The FBI, DEA, and Texas Rangers descended like a storm, their presence a stark reminder that this was no longer a local matter. This was a federal case, and it was about to blow wide open. The first 48 hours were chaos. The crime scenes, Marcus's home, and the sheriff's office were locked down, cordoned off with yellow tape. Forensic teams moved in, their gloved hands meticulously cataloging every shell casing, every bullet trajectory, every drop of blood. The evidence was overwhelming, but the biggest clue didn't come from the scene. It came from a voice, a witness, someone who had been too afraid to speak, until now. Her name was Maricela Torres. A waitress at a small cantina in Laredo, she had spent years serving drinks to men who whispered secrets over tequila. She had learned not to listen, not to ask questions. But one night, she overheard something she couldn't forget. Two men sitting in a dimly lit booth, their voices low but urgent. One of them she recognized, El Zorro, a high-ranking enforcer for Los Reyes del Sur, the cartel that had turned Rio Verde into a battleground. The other man she didn't know, but his words sent a chill down her spine. Tomorrow it ends. The man had said, the sheriff. El Zorro had leaned back, a slow, deliberate grin spreading across his face. Not just him, he replied. His whole world. Maricela didn't wait to hear more. She quit her job that night and fled to Rio Verde, hoping to disappear. But when the massacre happened, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Sitting in a small motel room off the highway, she lit a cigarette with trembling hands and dialed the number for the FBI tip line. Her voice shook as she recounted what she had heard. She didn't know if it would help, but she knew she had to try. Her tip was the break investigators needed. It confirmed what they had suspected. The attack wasn't random. It was a message, a brutal, calculated act of retribution, and it had been ordered by the cartel. The FBI moved quickly, tracing the connections, following the money, and unraveling the web of corruption that Marcus had helped weave. The first major arrest came just 2 weeks after the attack. El Zorro, the man who had ordered the hit, was tracked down in Mexico. He had gone into hiding, knowing the full force of American law enforcement was coming for him. But in the cartel world, loyalty is fluid. A rival faction gave up his location in exchange for leniency on their own operations. Mexican authorities, working alongside U.S. Marshals, raided a compound outside Nuevo Laredo. The firefight lasted nearly an hour. When the dust settled, El Zorro was in custody, dragged from a bullet-riddled house, blood on his face, screaming that he was untouchable. He was wrong. Within days, he was extradited to the U.S. to face federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder. His arrest was a victory, but it was just the beginning. Over the next several months, law enforcement dismantled Marcus's entire network. High-ranking members of Los Reyes del Sur were arrested in a sweeping DEA operation. A former deputy, Marcus's second-in-command, was indicted for aiding and abetting. Even a local judge was implicated for covering up cartel money laundering. The revelations shook the region to its core. Marcus hadn't been a lone corrupt officer. He had been part of something far larger, an intricate web of law enforcement and cartel collaboration that had thrived in the shadows for years. The fallout from Marcus Thompson's betrayal didn't end with his conviction. It rippled through Rio Verde and beyond, leaving a trail of broken trust and shattered lives. The town, once a quiet haven near the Mexican border, became a symbol of the dangers of corruption and the devastating consequences of a broken system. For the residents of Rio Verde, the massacre wasn't just a crime, it was a wake-up call. In the weeks following the trial, the town held a memorial for Keisha and Malik Thompson. The service was held in the small church where Keisha had sung in the choir and where Malik had been baptized. The pews were packed with mourners, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. Tiana, still recovering from her injuries, sat in the front row, her eyes hollow, her hands clutching a single white rose. She didn't speak during the service. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a reminder of the cost of her father's choices. Marcus, now serving his life sentence in a maximum security prison, was not allowed to attend the funeral. He watched the news coverage from a small TV in the prison common room, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. He had lost everything: his family, his freedom, his legacy. And as he sat there staring at the screen, he realized that no amount of time behind bars could ever make up for what he had done. But the story didn't end with Marcus. The investigation into the cartel's operations continued, uncovering a network of corruption that extended far beyond Rio Verde. High-ranking officials, both in law enforcement and local government, were implicated in the scandal. The DEA and FBI worked tirelessly to dismantle the cartel's infrastructure, making arrests and seizing assets. It was a long, grueling process, but it was necessary to ensure that justice was served. One of the most shocking revelations came when a former deputy, Marcus's second-in-command, agreed to testify against the cartel in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony exposed the depth of the corruption within the sheriff's office, revealing how the cartel had infiltrated every level of law enforcement in Rio Verde. It was a damning indictment of the system, and it led to sweeping reforms in small-town policing across the state. For Tiana, the aftermath of the massacre was a daily struggle. She moved to Houston to live with her aunt, trying to start a new life away from the memories of Rio Verde. But the scars, both physical and emotional, were a constant reminder of what she had lost. She underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage from the gunshot wounds, and she spent months in physical therapy, learning to walk again. But the emotional wounds were harder to heal. Nightmares haunted her sleep. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of gunshots ringing in her ears. Therapy helped, but it was a slow process. She found solace in writing, pouring her thoughts and feelings into a journal. Over time, she began to share her story, speaking out about the dangers of corruption and the importance of holding those in power accountable. Her courage inspired others, and she became a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Back in Rio Verde, the town began to rebuild. The sheriff's office was restructured, with new policies and procedures put in place to prevent future corruption. The community came together, holding fundraisers and vigils to honor the victims of the massacre. But the scars remained. The once trusting residents of Rio Verde now viewed law enforcement with suspicion, and the sense of safety that Marcus had once provided was gone. In the years that followed, Marcus received few visitors. Tiana came once shortly after her 18th birthday. The meeting was brief and painful. She looked at him with a mixture of anger and sadness, her eyes searching for the father she had once known. But that man was gone, replaced by a broken, hollow shell. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. As the years passed, Marcus became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of greed and the cost of betrayal. His story was told in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books, each one dissecting his rise and fall with clinical precision. But for the people of Rio Verde, Marcus Thompson was more than just a story. He was a man who had betrayed their trust, a man who had shattered their lives, and they would never forget.